He stood over his son's screaming body, helpless, furious, and desperate, while the experts failed him again. Then, the maid's daughter stepped forward, calm as rain, and did something no amount of money ever could. Welcome to Tales by Orion. Let's uncover what really happened. The Worthington estate sprawled across acres of manicured green, a monument to wealth so vast it seemed to warp the very air around it. Hedges sculpted into impossible creatures stood guard along a driveway that wound like a lazy river towards the main house, a structure of cold stone and glass that gleamed under the perpetually overcast sky of the region. Inside, the silence was a living entity, broken only by the hushed footfalls of staff on marble floors or the distant, automated hum of unseen systems maintaining an atmosphere of sterile perfection. Alistair Worthington, the master of this domain, moved through its echoing halls like a phantom of his own making. His face, once sharp and animated with the thrill of corporate conquest, was now etched with lines of a different battle, one fought not in boardrooms, but in the quiet, desperate corners of his own home. He was a man who could command markets and move mountains of capital with a single phone call, yet he found himself utterly powerless before the small, fragile enigma that was his son, Leo. Leo was 8, a wisp of a boy with eyes the color of a stormy sea, usually fixed on some point beyond the immediate world. He navigated the opulent spaces of the mansion like a visitor from another realm. His silence, a wall Alistair couldn't breach, his occasional outbursts of distress, a storm Alistair couldn't calm. A parade of renowned specialists, therapists, and educators had passed through the Worthington gates, each promising understanding, each armed with theories and techniques, and each ultimately departing, leaving behind a residue of frustration and a heavier silence. Alistair remembered the hollow echo of their pronouncements, nonverbal, profound sensory sensitivities, complex needs, words that explained nothing of the ache in his chest when he looked at his son, a son he loved with a fierce, clumsy intensity but could not reach. The latest specialist, a woman with a string of degrees and a calm, patronizing demeanor, had just left. Her final assessment, delivered in carefully modulated tones, was that Leo's environment might be overly stimulating despite its minimalism, and that expectations needed to be managed. Alistair had listened, nodded, and shown her out, the familiar taste of ash in his mouth. He now stood in his study, a room lined with books he no longer read and awards that felt like relics from a past life, staring out at the rain-streaked gardens. The helplessness was a physical weight pressing down on him, suffocating. He longed for a sign, a flicker, anything to suggest that the boy he knew was still in there, lost in the labyrinth of his own mind. Maria Reyes, the head housekeeper, had been with the Worthingtons for over a decade. She was a woman of quiet dignity and unwavering diligence, her movements economical, her presence unobtrusive. She had witnessed the slow erosion of Alistair's confidence, the deepening shadows under his eyes, and the increasingly desperate edge to his voice when he spoke of Leo. Her heart ached for them both, but she knew her place. She managed the household with quiet efficiency, ensuring the superficial order that Alistair craved, even as the emotional core of the home crumbled. Maria often brought her daughter, Clara, with her in the afternoons, especially when school was out or when Maria had to stay late. Clara was 17, a girl with a gentle face and eyes that seemed to absorb the world with a quiet intensity. While her mother worked, Clara would often find a quiet nook, perhaps in a vast, underused library or a sunlit alcove overlooking the gardens, where she would sketch in a worn notebook or lose herself in the pages of a book. She was as much a fixture of the house's quiet afternoons as the grandfather clock in the hall, yet she moved with such discretion that she was rarely noticed by Alistair. Clara had seen Leo, not often, and usually from a distance. She'd seen him in the garden, tracing patterns on a dew-covered window pane, or heard the faint, solitary notes he sometimes coaxed from the grand piano in the music room. Discordant to most, but to Clara, they held a strange, lonely beauty. She'd also witnessed, from afar, the build-up to his meltdowns, the subtle shifts in his posture, the way his hands would flutter, signs that seemed to escape the notice of the highly paid professionals. There was a particular afternoon, the rain lashing against the tall windows of the conservatory, when Leo had been overcome. His cries, sharp and piercing, cut through the usual stillness of the house. Alistair had rushed in, his face a mask of panic and exasperation. Clara, who had been sketching a wilting orchid nearby, had looked up, her gaze drawn to the scene. Her heart had clenched not with fear, but with a profound, almost painful empathy. She saw not a problem to be managed, but a small soul in deep distress, overwhelmed by a world that didn't speak his language. Her fingers had stilled on her sketchbook, her expression unreadable to anyone who might have glanced her way, but her dark eyes held a depth of understanding that belied her years. She saw the patterns in his distress, the triggers that the adults, in their frantic attempts to control, seemed to exacerbate. Alistair, in the aftermath of that particular episode, after another specialist had offered platitudes and prescribed yet another medication adjustment, had retreated to his study, the door firmly closed. He didn't shout. He didn't break anything. Instead, a heavy, weary sigh had escaped him, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of all his failed hopes. Maria, polishing a nearby silver tray, had heard it, her own shoulders slumping imperceptibly. Clara, waiting for her mother in the hallway, had heard it too, and her gaze drifted towards the wing of the house where Leo's rooms were located, a silent question in her eyes. The mansion, for all its grandeur, felt like a gilded cage, holding not just a misunderstood boy, but also a father imprisoned by his own desperate love and limitations. And in the periphery, unnoticed, was a young woman who saw not the gilded bars, but the fragile bird within. The days that followed the departure of the latest specialist settled into a familiar rhythm of quiet tension. Alistair Worthington threw himself into his work with a renewed, almost frantic energy, as if by conquering distant markets, he could somehow compensate for the unconquerable territory of his son's mind. He took calls at all hours, his voice crisp and decisive, a stark contrast to the hesitant, almost pleading tone he used when trying to coax a response from Leo. The house staff, sensing his mood, moved with even greater caution, their interactions with him brief and formal. Leo, meanwhile, remained in his own world, a world punctuated by moments of intense focus on seemingly insignificant objects. The play of light on a crystal paperweight, the texture of a velvet curtain, the complex pattern of a Persian rug, and moments of sudden, overwhelming sensory overload that would send him spiraling into distress. These episodes were becoming more frequent, or perhaps Alistair was simply more acutely aware of them, his patience worn thin, his reserves of hope dwindling. One late afternoon, a storm mirroring the turmoil within the house gathered outside. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled around the stone corners of the mansion. Inside, the oppressive silence was broken by the distant, muffled sounds of Leo's growing agitation. Alistair was in the middle of a crucial video conference, a deal worth millions hanging in the balance. He tried to focus, to maintain the air of unshakable command that was his hallmark, but the sounds from Leo's wing of the house were like needles pricking at his concentration. He could hear the rising pitch of his son's cries, the thud of something heavy falling, the frantic, placating murmurs of Mrs. Gable, Leo's current nanny, a kind but increasingly overwhelmed woman. Alistair's jaw tightened. He excused himself abruptly from the conference, muttering something about a critical domestic issue, the irony of his words lost on his bewildered international colleagues. He strode towards Leo's room, his footsteps echoing his rising anger and despair. The scene that greeted him was one of familiar chaos. Leo was in the midst of a full-blown meltdown, his small body rigid, his face contorted, his screams tearing through the air. Mrs. Gable was trying to hold him, to soothe him, but her efforts only seemed to fuel his distress. Toys were scattered, a lamp lay overturned, its shade askew. Alistair felt a surge of fury, irrational and immense, directed at the situation, at Leo, at himself, at the world. "Can no one handle him?" he roared, his voice thundering in the suddenly quieted room. Leo flinched violently at the sound, his screams devolving into hiccuping sobs. Mrs. Gable looked up, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Mr. Worthington, I don't know what to do anymore. Nothing works." Her voice was a whisper of defeat. Just then, Maria entered the room, drawn by the commotion. She carried a tray with a glass of water, her usual remedy for frayed nerves, though she knew it was inadequate for this. Behind her, unseen in the doorway, stood Clara. She had been in the adjoining sunroom, attempting to finish a school assignment, when the escalating sounds had become impossible to ignore. She now peered into the room, her expression a mixture of concern and a strange, focused calm. Alistair barely registered Maria's presence. His gaze was fixed on his son, who was now curled into a tight ball on the floor, rocking back and forth, emitting small, wounded sounds. The sight broke through Alistair's anger, leaving behind a vast, hollow ache. He felt a familiar despair wash over him, the crushing weight of his inadequacy as a father. He had all the resources in the world, yet he couldn't provide his son with the one thing he truly needed: peace. His eyes, sweeping the room in a desperate search for some solution, some answer, landed on Clara, who had inadvertently stepped further into view. He'd seen her around, the maid's quiet daughter, always with a book or sketchbook. He barely knew her name. In that moment, fueled by a bitter cocktail of frustration, desperation, and a sudden, cruel impulse, an idea, ugly and sharp, pierced through his fog of despair. He gestured sharply towards Clara, his voice dripping with a sarcasm born of utter hopelessness. "You," he said, his tone harsh. "You're always lurking, watching. You think you understand something we don't." Clara froze, her eyes wide, startled by the sudden, aggressive attention. Maria stepped forward protectively. "Sir, please, she's just a child. She meant no harm." Alistair waved her away dismissively. "A child? She's practically a young woman. Perhaps she has some hidden talent for this chaos." He looked at Leo, then back at Clara, a cynical, almost goading expression on his face. "Go on then," he challenged, his voice laced with a bitterness that shocked even himself. "You seem so observant. Why don't you try? Calm him down. Since all the experts and all my money can't do it, perhaps the maid's daughter can perform a miracle." The words hung in the air, heavy and cruel. Mrs. Gable gasped softly. Maria looked horrified, her hand flying her mouth. "Mr. Worthington, you can't be serious. She doesn't know anything about." But Alistair wasn't listening to Maria. His gaze was locked on Clara, a dare glinting in his eyes, a desperate, almost nihilistic curiosity to see what would happen. He expected her to shrink away, to stammer an apology, to flee. It was a mean-spirited test, a way to displace his own profound sense of failure onto someone else, someone inconsequential in his grand scheme of things. He was in that moment a man at the very end of his rope, lashing out blindly. Clara stood rooted to the spot, the color draining from her face. The challenge was outrageous, demeaning. Yet, as she looked past Alistair's tormented expression, past her mother's horrified face, her gaze settled on the small, trembling figure of Leo on the floor. The sound of his distress, the raw pain in it, seemed to resonate deep within her, eclipsing the shock and insult of Alistair's words. For a long moment, the room was silent save for Leo's ragged breathing. Then, to Alistair's utter astonishment, Clara took a small, hesitant step forward. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Alistair Worthington's words, sharp and barbed, echoed in the opulent room. He was daring her, mocking her, using her as a desperate last-ditch spectacle. Her mother's horrified gasp, Mrs. Gable's pitying stare, it all pressed in on her. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and flee, to escape the crushing weight of the billionaire's scorn and the impossible task he had thrown at her feet. Yet, her gaze remained fixed on Leo, the small, curled figure on the floor, emitting those tiny, heartbroken sounds, seemed to pull at something deep within her, a chord of empathy so profound it vibrated through her entire being. She had seen his meltdowns before, from a distance, had observed the way his senses seemed to betray him, turning the world into a cacophony of overwhelming stimuli. She had noticed how the frantic attempts to soothe him, the loud voices, the sudden movements, often seemed to make things worse, like throwing fuel on a fire. In this moment, standing on the precipice of an unimaginable challenge, a strange calm began to settle over her initial fear. It wasn't confidence, not in the conventional sense. It was something quieter, an intuitive sense that she needed to try, not for Alistair, not to prove anything, but for Leo. She took another small step, then another, her movements slow, deliberate, almost dreamlike. She was acutely aware of Alistair's eyes burning into her back, of her mother's silent, anguished plea for her to stop. But the sounds of Leo's distress were a stronger magnet, drawing her forward. As she neared him, she didn't speak. She didn't reach out to touch him. Instead, she sank slowly to the floor, not directly in front of him, but a respectful distance away, slightly to his side, making herself smaller, less imposing. The vast, ornate room seemed to fade, the other adults receding into the periphery of her awareness. There was only her and Leo and the storm of his emotions. She sat, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her posture relaxed, her breathing consciously slow and even. She remembered once reading about how animals in distress often responded to calm, non-threatening presences. She didn't think of Leo as an animal, of course, but she sensed that his overwhelmed nervous system might respond similarly. She began to hum, a very soft, low, repetitive melody. It wasn't a recognizable tune, more like a series of soothing, resonant notes, almost a chant, barely audible above the lingering sounds of Leo's sobs. It was a melody she often hummed to herself when she was sketching or feeling anxious, something that came from a place deep inside her, wordless and comforting. Alistair watched, his arms crossed, a cynical smirk playing on his lips, though beneath it, a flicker of unwilling curiosity began to stir. This was not what he had expected. He had anticipated fumbling attempts at placation, perhaps some childish mimicry of the therapist's techniques. This quiet, almost meditative approach was different. He saw Maria wring her hands, her face a mask of worry for her daughter, caught in this bizarre, unwinnable scenario. Mrs. Gable hovered near the doorway, ready to intervene if things escalated further, though a kind of weary resignation had settled over her. Leo, at first, didn't seem to react to Clara's presence or her humming. He continued to rock, his small hands pressed over his ears, though perhaps the intensity of his movements lessened fractionally. Clara didn't change her approach. She just continued to hum, her gaze soft, not directly on Leo, but in his general direction, creating a gentle, auditory blanket. Minutes stretched by, thick with unspoken tension. The only sounds were Leo's quieting whimpers, the rain lashing against the windows, and Clara's incredibly soft, continuous humming. Then something shifted. Leo's rocking became less frantic. One small hand slowly, tentatively, moved away from his ear. His head, still bowed, tilted ever so slightly, as if listening. Clara didn't acknowledge the change outwardly. She kept her rhythm, her melody, her stillness. She knew that any sudden movement, any change in her demeanor, might shatter the fragile, tentative calm that seemed to be slowly, painstakingly weaving itself in the space between them. She focused on her breath, on the resonance of the hum in her own chest, trying to project a sense of peace, of safety. Alistair found himself leaning forward almost imperceptibly. The smirk had vanished from his face, replaced by an expression of guarded attentiveness. He couldn't deny it. The atmosphere in the room had changed. The raw, jagged edges of Leo's distress seemed to be smoothing out. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible if one wasn't watching closely, but it was there. He glanced at Maria, who was now watching her daughter with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Mrs. Gable, too, seemed to be holding her breath. After what felt like an eternity, but was perhaps only 10 or 15 minutes, Leo's rocking stopped altogether. He remained curled, but the tension in his small body seemed to have eased. He slowly, very slowly, lifted his head a few inches, his tear-stained face still mostly hidden, but his visible eye was no longer squeezed shut in pain. It was open, albeit unfocused, gazing towards the floor near where Clara sat. Clara, sensing this subtle shift, very slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to incorporate a soft, rhythmic tapping into her routine. Using 2 fingers, she began to tap a gentle, steady beat on her own knee, a simple, predictable pattern. Dum-dum-dum. Pause. Dum-dum-dum. Pause. It was a rhythm as simple and primal as a heartbeat. Leo's head tilted a fraction more. His gaze, previously unfocused, seemed to find the gentle movement of her fingers. He watched, his expression still unreadable, but the frantic energy that had consumed him earlier was undeniably dissipating, replaced by a wary, exhausted stillness. Alistair felt a strange tightening in his own chest. He didn't understand what he was seeing. There were no words, no complex techniques, just a teenage girl, humming and tapping, and his son, his unreachable son, was responding. It wasn't a miracle, not yet, but it was something. It was a silence that wasn't born of despair, but of a nascent, fragile peace. He had thrown down a cruel, impossible gauntlet, and against all odds, this quiet, unassuming girl hadn't just picked it up. She seemed to be disarming it with nothing but her own innate, gentle grace. The silence in the room, once oppressive and filled with Leo's distress, now held a different quality, a delicate, tentative calm, as fragile as spun glass. Clara continued her soft humming and the gentle, rhythmic tapping on her knee. She didn't try to bridge the remaining distance between herself and Leo, didn't try to coax him or speak to him. She simply maintained her peaceful, unobtrusive presence, creating a small island of predictability in his often chaotic sensory world. Leo remained on the floor, no longer curled in a tight ball of misery, but slightly unraveled, his limbs a little looser. His gaze, which had briefly flickered towards Clara's tapping fingers, now rested on a dust mote dancing in a stray sunbeam that had pierced through the storm clouds. He seemed to be listening, not just with his ears, but with his whole being, to the subtle symphony of Clara's quiet ministrations and the receding rumble of the storm outside. Alistair Worthington stood frozen, a statue carved from disbelief. The anger and cynicism that had fueled his cruel dare had evaporated, leaving behind a profound, unsettling sense of bewilderment. He had witnessed countless expensive therapies, intricate behavioral programs, and pharmacological interventions, all designed to manage, to control, to fix his son. None had produced this quiet yielding. He watched Clara, truly seeing her for perhaps the first time. She wasn't lurking, as he'd so callously accused. She was present. Her stillness was not a void, but a container. Her quietness was not emptiness, but a deep, resonant calm. He saw the way her shoulders were relaxed, the gentle focus in her eyes, the almost imperceptible sway of her body as she hummed. There was an artistry to it, an intuitive grace that no textbook could teach. His mind reeled. He, Alistair Worthington, a titan of industry, a man who prided himself on his intellect and his ability to dissect complex problems, was utterly baffled by the simplicity and efficacy of what he was witnessing. He had sought answers in complexity, in expertise, in expenditure, and all along, a quiet teenager in his own household possessed a key he hadn't even known existed. Maria, meanwhile, watched her daughter with a dawning sense of wonder that overshadowed her earlier fear. She had always known Clara was special, sensitive, deeply empathetic, but she had never seen this facet of her, this ability to soothe, to connect on such a profound, nonverbal level. A swell of pride, fierce and protective, rose in her chest, mingled with a renewed anxiety about how Alistair would react once this fragile truce inevitably ended. Mrs. Gable, the nanny, simply looked relieved, the tension draining from her face. She had been on the verge of resigning, feeling utterly defeated by Leo's increasingly intense episodes. Now, she saw a glimmer of something she hadn't dared to hope for. After another long stretch of this quiet communion, Clara made another subtle shift. She very slowly reached into the pocket of her loose cardigan and pulled out a small, smooth, gray stone. It was an ordinary stone, one she had picked up on a beach years ago, its surface worn smooth by the relentless caress of the waves. She held it in her open palm, not offering it to Leo, but simply holding it, letting the light play on its surface. She then began to slowly, rhythmically, pass the stone from one hand to the other, her movements fluid and predictable. Leo's eyes, which had been following the dust mote, were drawn to the small, rhythmic movement in Clara's hands. He watched the stone, its cool gray color a stark contrast to the rich, overwhelming colors of the room he usually found so distressing. His breathing, which had been shallow and ragged, deepened slightly, becoming more regular. Clara continued the movement, her gaze soft, her humming now almost subliminal, a mere vibration in the air. She was building layers of calm, one gentle, predictable sensory input at a time. She wasn't trying to force a connection. She was inviting it, creating a safe space where Leo might choose to emerge, even if only for a moment. Alistair felt a lump form in his throat. He recognized the stone. He had seen Clara with it before, often rolling it between her fingers while she read or sketched. He had dismissed it as a childish habit. Now he saw it as a tool, an anchor, wielded with an unconscious wisdom that humbled him. He thought of all the expensive, specially designed sensory tools they had bought for Leo, most of which lay untouched in a cupboard, either too complex, too stimulating, or simply failing to resonate with his son's unique sensitivities. And here was this girl with a simple beach stone, achieving what a room full of therapeutic gadgets could not. The air in the room was thick with unspoken emotion. The storm outside had passed, and the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shafts of light through the windows, illuminating the scene with an almost theatrical glow. Leo, bathed in this gentle light, slowly, tentatively, uncurled one of his hands, which had been clenched into a fist. His small fingers twitched, then relaxed. He wasn't reaching out, not yet, but it was a sign, a minuscule opening in the fortress of his distress. Clara saw it. She didn't react, didn't change her rhythm. She simply acknowledged it internally, a small, quiet spark of hope igniting within her. She knew this was a delicate dance, a conversation spoken not in words, but in breath, in rhythm, in shared stillness. Each tiny positive response from Leo was a precious gift, to be received with gratitude and infinite patience. The trust being built in that room was more fragile than an ancient manuscript, more valuable than all the Worthington fortune. Alistair swallowed hard, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He felt an overwhelming urge to speak, to thank Clara, to apologize for his earlier cruelty, but he clamped his jaw shut, instinctively understanding that any disruption could shatter this precious, nascent peace. He could only watch, a silent, humbled observer to a miracle woven from the simplest of threads. Empathy, patience, and a quiet, unassuming girl's profound understanding of a boy the world had deemed unreachable. His own carefully constructed world, built on power and control, was beginning to tilt on its axis. The atmosphere in Leo's room remained suspended in a delicate equilibrium. Clara, with her soft humming and the rhythmic passing of the smooth gray stone between her hands, had created a sanctuary of calm. Leo, no longer distressed, sat quietly, his gaze flickering between the stone in Clara's hands and the patterns of sunlight on the carpet. His breathing was even, his small body relaxed in a way Alistair hadn't seen in months, perhaps even years, outside of deep sleep. The raw, jagged energy that usually emanated from him during and after a meltdown was gone, replaced by an almost serene stillness. Alistair found himself holding his breath, afraid that even the sound of his own respiration might disturb the fragile peace. He looked at his son, truly looked at him, and saw not a collection of symptoms or a diagnostic label, but a child, vulnerable and beautiful, who was for this fleeting moment at rest. A wave of emotion, so potent it almost buckled his knees, washed over him, a complex mix of relief, shame, and a dawning, incredulous hope. He thought of the harshness of his dare, the cynical dismissal with which he had treated Clara. He had expected her to fail, perhaps even taken a perverse satisfaction in the thought that if all the experts couldn't help, then certainly this untrained girl couldn't either, thereby validating his own despair. Instead, she had responded not with fear or anger, but with a quiet courage and an intuitive wisdom that left him speechless. He watched her now, her young face serene, her focus entirely on Leo, oblivious to the profound impact she was having on the billionaire who observed her. There was no artifice in her, no desire for praise or recognition. She was simply being authentically and compassionately, in a way that resonated with his son's deepest needs. Maria stood near the doorway, tears silently tracing paths down her cheeks. They were tears of relief, of pride, of a profound, almost spiritual gratitude. She had always known her daughter possessed a special gentleness, a quiet empathy that drew animals and small children to her. But to witness it in this context, to see it calming the storms within the troubled Worthington air, was nothing short of miraculous. She caught Alistair's eye for a fleeting moment, and saw in his expression not the usual arrogance or impatience, but something raw and vulnerable, something that looked like awe. Mrs. Gable, the nanny, had quietly slipped out of the room, perhaps to compose herself or to allow this delicate interaction to unfold without too many observers. The focus remained on the two young people in the center of the room, locked in their silent, gentle communion. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Clara, sensing Leo's sustained calm, very slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to alter her rhythm. The passing of the stone became a little slower, her humming a little softer, gradually guiding the energy in the room towards an even deeper state of tranquility. She then did something unexpected. She very gently placed the smooth, gray stone on the carpet midway between herself and Leo. She didn't push it towards him, didn't gesture. She simply placed it there, an unspoken offering, a point of shared focus. Leo's gaze followed the stone. He watched it settle on the plush fibers of the carpet. For a long moment, he did nothing. Then, with a slowness that was almost agonizing to watch, he extended a tentative finger towards it. His finger hovered over the stone, then retreated, then extended again. It was a dance of curiosity and hesitation. Clara remained perfectly still, her hands now resting loosely in her lap, her humming a mere breath. She offered no encouragement, no prompting, just patient, silent presence. Finally, Leo's finger touched the stone. Just a light, fleeting touch. He then drew his hand back quickly, as if surprised by his own action. But a moment later, his hand crept out again, and this time, his small fingers closed around the stone. He didn't lift it immediately. He just held it, his head bowed, perhaps feeling its coolness, its smoothness, its comforting weight. Alistair felt his own hands clench. He could scarcely believe what he was seeing. Leo rarely engaged with new objects so readily, especially not when offered by another person. He usually shied away or ignored them completely. Yet, here he was, holding the stone Clara had offered, a simple, ordinary stone that now seemed imbued with an extraordinary significance. After a few moments, Leo lifted the stone. He didn't throw it, didn't bang it. He brought it closer to his face, examining it with an intensity that was characteristic of his focus moments. He turned it over in his small hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then he looked up. He looked directly at Clara. His gaze, usually so elusive, met hers. It was not a fleeting glance, but a direct, sustained look. And in his eyes, clouded by so much that Alistair didn't understand. There was something new, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even a nascent trust. Clara met his gaze with a soft, almost imperceptible smile. It was a smile that held no demands, no expectations, just gentle acknowledgement. In that moment, a connection was forged, silent and profound, a bridge built across the chasm of Leo's isolation. The impact of that shared glance, that silent acknowledgement, was not lost on Alistair. It was as if a shutter had clicked open in a darkened room, allowing a sliver of light to penetrate the gloom. It was more than just calm. It was engagement. It was a response. It was, in its own quiet way, a communication. The full weight of what he was witnessing, the sheer unlikelihood of it, the quiet miracle unfolding before his disbelieving eyes, crashed down upon Alistair Worthington. The carefully constructed dam of his composure, already weakened by shame and burgeoning hope, finally broke. A single tear escaped his eye, tracing a hot path down his cheek. It was followed by another, and then another. He didn't bother to wipe them away. He stood there, the powerful, indomitable billionaire, weeping silently as he watched a teenage girl and his autistic son share a moment of profound, unspoken connection over a simple gray stone. The sound of his own choked sob was a quiet punctuation mark in the otherwise serene room. The profound stillness that had settled in Leo's room was now imbued with a new layer of emotional intensity, not from Leo's distress, but from the raw, unvarnished display of Alistair Worthington's tears. Clara, though her primary focus remained on Leo, was peripherally aware of the billionaire's quiet breakdown. She didn't acknowledge it, didn't look towards him. Her intuitive understanding told her that his tears were a private reckoning, a release of long-held pain, frustration, and perhaps a dawning, fragile hope. To draw attention to it would be to break the sanctity of the moment. Leo, still holding the smooth gray stone, continued to look at Clara. His expression was calm, his earlier agitation completely gone. He seemed almost oblivious to his father's emotional state, cocooned as he was in the tranquil space Clara had woven around them. He turned the stone over and over in his small hand, his gaze thoughtful. Then he did something that caused Alistair's breath to catch in his throat. Leo slowly, deliberately, extended the hand holding the stone towards Clara. It wasn't an aggressive gesture, nor a dismissive one. It was an offering, a reciprocation of the gesture she had made earlier. He held it out, his small face tilted up towards hers, an unspoken question in his eyes. Clara's gentle smile widened slightly. She very slowly reached out and allowed her fingers to brush against his as she accepted the stone. The touch was brief, feather-light, but it was a point of physical contact initiated by Leo. Alistair watched, tears still streaming down his face, a knot of emotion tightening in his chest so intensely he could barely breathe. His son, who recoiled from most physical touch, who rarely initiated any form of interaction, was willingly, gently, offering something to this girl. It was a gesture so small, yet so monumental, that it felt like the earth had shifted beneath Alistair's feet. Maria, who had been watching with tear-filled eyes herself, pressed a hand to her heart. She understood the magnitude of what was happening. This was not just about calming a meltdown. This was about connection, about trust, about a silent language being spoken and understood between two souls who existed outside the conventional norms of communication. Clara held the stone for a moment. Then, with the same slow deliberation Leo had shown, she placed it back on the carpet between them. She then picked up her sketchbook and a charcoal pencil, which she had left on a nearby table before approaching Leo. She didn't open it to a blank page. Instead, she flipped to a page where she had previously sketched a detailed, intricate drawing of a feather. It was a simple subject, but rendered with exquisite detail and a profound sense of quiet beauty. She placed the open sketchbook on the floor, angled slightly so Leo could see it if he chose. She didn't point to it, didn't try to draw his attention to it. She simply made it available, another quiet offering in their unfolding silent dialogue. Then she began to hum again, that same soft, resonant melody, her gaze gentle, her presence a steady, calming anchor. Leo's attention, which had been on the stone, now shifted to the sketchbook. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes tracing the delicate lines of the feather Clara had drawn. He seemed captivated by the intricate patterns, the subtle shading. He spent several long minutes just looking at it, his small face a study in concentration. Alistair watched, his weeping subsiding into a series of shuddering breaths. He felt utterly drained, yet strangely lighter, as if a tremendous burden had been lifted from his shoulders. The shame for his earlier outburst was still there, a dull ache, but it was now overshadowed by an overwhelming sense of gratitude and wonder. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was witnessing something transformative, not just for Leo, but for himself as well. He had been so focused on finding a cure, a solution, on forcing Leo to fit into his world, that he had failed to see the possibility of meeting Leo in his. Clara, with her quiet empathy and intuitive understanding, had shown him that bridge. After a while, Leo reached out a tentative finger and gently touched the surface of the drawing, tracing the curve of the feather. He made a small sound, a soft, inquisitive hum. It wasn't a word, but it was a vocalization, an expression of interest directed towards the drawing, towards Clara. Clara looked at him and nodded slowly, a soft smile on her lips. "Feather," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Just one word, spoken gently, without expectation. Leo didn't repeat the word. He didn't need to. The communication was happening on a different plane, a level of shared experience and quiet understanding that transcended spoken language. He continued to study the drawing. Then his gaze flickered back to Clara, then to the stone, then back to the drawing. It was as if he were processing, connecting, making sense of these gentle, positive interactions in his own way. The oppressive atmosphere of the Worthington mansion, usually so heavy with unspoken anxieties and frustrations, felt different in this room. It was filled with a quiet, luminous peace, a sense of fragile hope taking root. Alistair knew this single episode wouldn't magically solve all of Leo's challenges, but it was a profound beginning, a monumental step. He looked at Clara, this unassuming girl who had, in the space of an hour, achieved more than a legion of experts. He owed her an apology, a profound one. He owed her his gratitude. He owed her everything. As the last rays of the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the room, Leo, still looking at the drawing of the feather, leaned almost imperceptibly towards Clara. It was a tiny movement, a slight inclination of his body in her direction, but it spoke volumes. It was a gesture of trust, of comfort, of a dawning connection. And Alistair Worthington, watching his son lean towards the maid's daughter, felt his carefully constructed world dismantle and reshape itself around this quiet, undeniable truth. True wealth, true power, lay not in possessions or command, but in the simple, profound ability to connect, to understand, and to love. And in that moment, he felt poorer and richer than he had ever been in his life. The quiet miracle in Leo's room lingered in the air like the scent of rain after a long drought. The sun had dipped lower, painting the opulent furnishings in hues of gold and amber. Leo, still calm, eventually shifted his attention from Clara's sketchbook back to the gray stone, which he picked up again, cradling it in his palm as if it were a precious treasure. Clara, sensing a natural lull, a point of peaceful closure to their intense interaction, slowly began to gather her few belongings, her sketchbook, her pencil. She did so with no sudden movements, no disruption to the tranquility she had so painstakingly woven. Alistair Worthington, his face still bearing the traces of his earlier tears, finally found his voice. It was hoarse, raspy, barely above a whisper. "Clara," he said, the name feeling unfamiliar yet profoundly significant on his tongue. Clara looked up at him, her expression calm, her eyes holding no trace of judgment, only a quiet, steady attentiveness. "Leo," hearing his father's voice, glanced briefly towards him, then back to the stone in his hand, seemingly unperturbed. I don't know what to say, Alistair began, the admission of inadequacy a stark contrast to his usual commanding tone. He took a step closer, his movements hesitant, as if treading on sacred ground. Thank you. What you just did with Leo, it was... He trailed off, searching for words that felt insufficient. Miraculous seemed too trite. Amazing too shallow for the depth of what he had witnessed. Maria, who had re-entered the room as the intensity subsided, stood near her daughter, a hand resting lightly on Clara's shoulder, a gesture of quiet support and immense pride. She looked at Alistair, her own eyes still luminous with emotion. Clara has a gift, sir, Maria said softly, a way with those who are hurting or who see the world differently. Alistair nodded, his gaze fixed on Clara. A gift is an understatement, Maria. He looked directly at Clara then, his expression a mixture of awe, humility, and profound remorse. Clara, I was cruel to you. My challenge, my words, they were born of my own frustration and despair. There's no excuse for it. I am deeply, truly sorry. His apology was heartfelt, stripped of all pretense. The powerful billionaire, humbled before the quiet grace of his maid's daughter. Clara simply nodded, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She wasn't one to hold grudges. Her nature was too inherently compassionate for that. It's okay, Mr. Worthington, she said, her voice soft but clear. Leo was distressed. I just wanted to help him feel calmer. Calmer? Alistair let out a shaky laugh that was half a sob. Clara, he connected with you. He responded to you in ways I haven't seen him respond to anyone ever. The stone, the drawing, he trusted you. He gestured vaguely around the room, at the expensive and used therapeutic toys, at the charts left by previous specialists. We've tried everything. Everything money can buy. And you did it with a song, a stone, and your quiet presence. Leo, as if sensing the shift in conversation, looked up from his stone and made a soft sound, patting the carpet beside him, near where Clara had been sitting. It was an almost imperceptible gesture, easily missed, but Clara saw it. Alistair saw it too, his eyes widening. Did he just ask you to sit down again? He whispered, incredulous. Clara smiled faintly. I think he might just like the company. She hesitated for a moment. Then, with a glance at her mother and a nod from Alistair, she slowly sank back down to the floor, not as close as before, but within Leo's comfortable orbit. Leo seemed content with this, returning his attention to the stone, occasionally glancing up at Clara with that newfound, gentle curiosity in his eyes. Alistair watched them for a long moment, a profound sense of peace settling over him, a peace he hadn't realized he'd been so desperately missing. Maria, he said, turning to his housekeeper, his voice thick with emotion. Your daughter is extraordinary, truly extraordinary. Maria's smile was radiant. I've always known, sir. I want to understand, Alistair continued, his gaze shifting between Clara and Leo. How did you know what to do? The humming, the tapping, the stone, where did you learn that? Clara looked down for a moment, a hint of shyness in her demeanor. I don't really know, sir. I just watch Leo sometimes. I see what makes him anxious and what seems to calm him. I read a lot about animals, about how they communicate without words, how they respond to energy. I thought maybe some of that would help. He seems to like rhythms, predictable things, quiet things. The world is so loud for him sometimes, I think. Her explanation was simple, unpretentious, yet it held a depth of intuitive wisdom that resonated deeply with Alistair. He thought of all the clinical assessments, the behavioral charts, the data-driven approaches. None of them had factored in this simple, profound empathy, this ability to see the world through Leo's eyes. You see him, Clara, Alistair said softly, the realization dawning on him with the force of a revelation. That's the difference. You truly see him. The implications of this afternoon were beginning to unfurl in Alistair's mind. This wasn't just about one calmed meltdown. This was a potential turning point, a new path forward. He felt a surge of hope so strong it was almost painful. He looked at Clara, no longer just a maid's quiet daughter, but a beacon, a guide. The dynamic in the Worthington household had irrevocably shifted. The silence that often filled its halls might still exist, but now it held the promise of a different kind of quiet, not one of isolation, but of understanding, connection, and the gentle, unfolding miracle of a boy and a girl who spoke a language all their own. The tears had stopped, but the lump in Alistair's throat remained, a permanent reminder of the moment his world had been cracked open by the most unexpected of hands. The days following what Alistair Worthington privately termed the afternoon of the stone were marked by a subtle but profound shift within the cold, echoing walls of the Worthington estate. The oppressive tension that had become a permanent fixture seemed to have lessened, replaced by a fragile, tentative atmosphere of hope. Alistair himself was a changed man. The sharp edges of his impatience had softened, his brow less frequently furrowed in frustration. He found himself observing Leo with a new kind of attention, not looking for problems to solve, but for subtle cues, for the small indications of his son's inner world that Clara had so effortlessly perceived. He also found himself observing Clara with a mixture of awe and deep respect. He ensured her mother, Maria, knew that Clara was welcome in the house at any time, not just as a visitor waiting for her mother, but as someone important. He didn't quite know how to define her role yet, but he knew, with an unshakable certainty, that she was integral to Leo's well-being. He had, of course, offered Maria a significant bonus, an attempt to express his gratitude in the language he understood best. Maria had accepted it with quiet dignity, but Alistair knew that no amount of money could truly compensate for what Clara had given them. He also made sure to have a private conversation with Clara, reiterating his apology and expressing his profound gratitude. He asked her if she would be willing, if she felt comfortable, to spend more time with Leo. Not as a therapist, not as a nanny. He was careful to make that distinction, but simply as a friend. Clara, with her characteristic quiet humility, had agreed. She didn't ask for anything in return. Her motivation was clearly rooted in her genuine empathy for Leo. And so, a new routine began to establish itself. Clara would spend an hour or two with Leo most afternoons. Their interactions were always gentle, unhurried, guided by Leo's pace and preferences. Sometimes they would sit in silence, Clara sketching, Leo examining his stone or another object that caught his interest. Other times, Clara would hum her soft melodies or introduce a new, simple rhythm with gentle tapping. She brought in other natural objects for him to explore, a smooth piece of driftwood, a brightly colored autumn leaf, a bird's feather even more intricate than the one in her drawing. Leo's responses continued to be subtle but significant. He seemed more consistently calm in Clara's presence. The frequency and intensity of his meltdowns noticeably decreased. He began to make more eye contact with her, tentative at first, then more sustained. He even, on occasion, offered her a fleeting ghost of a smile. Alistair made it a point to observe these sessions whenever he could, always from a discreet distance, careful not to intrude. He learned more about his son in those quiet hours of observation than he had in years of consultations with specialists. He saw Leo's capacity for focused attention, his appreciation for sensory detail, his subtle ways of communicating his needs and preferences. He also saw Clara's remarkable patience, her intuitive understanding, her ability to create an environment of safety and acceptance that allowed Leo to simply be himself. One afternoon, Alistair watched as Clara showed Leo how to make patterns in a shallow tray of sand she had brought. Leo, who usually shied away from messy or unfamiliar textures, tentatively touched the sand. Then, following Clara's gentle guidance, began to drag his fingers through it, creating lines and swirls. A look of quiet absorption settled on his face. Alistair felt a familiar tightening in his throat. It was such a simple activity, yet it represented a monumental breakthrough. He remembered countless failed attempts by occupational therapists to engage Leo in similar sensory play, attempts that had often ended in frustration and distress. Clara made it look effortless, not through force or trickery, but through genuine connection and respect for Leo's boundaries. The staff, too, noticed the change. Mrs. Gable, the nanny, found her days less stressful, her interactions with Leo more positive. She began to adopt some of Clara's gentle techniques, learning to speak more softly, to move more slowly, to be more observant of Leo's subtle cues. Even the household chef started to notice that Leo was sometimes more receptive to trying new foods if Clara was nearby, her calm presence seeming to lower his anxieties. The ripple effect of Clara's influence was undeniable. Alistair started to reevaluate everything he thought he knew about his son's condition, about therapy, about connection. He began to research alternative approaches, not just those backed by prestigious institutions and hefty price tags, but those that emphasized empathy, sensory awareness, and child-led interaction. He found himself thinking less about fixing Leo and more about understanding and supporting him. He even started to question his own lifestyle, the relentless pursuit of wealth and power that had often come at the expense of time with his son. He began to delegate more at work, to be more present at home, not just physically but emotionally. He started joining Clara and Leo for short periods, not to interfere, but simply to be part of their quiet world, learning from Clara's example how to connect with his son on a deeper level. One evening, after Clara had left, Alistair found Leo sitting on the floor in his